Hey everyone, welcome to the Orange and Black Insider. It's that time of week again where we get together and talk all things Bengals. It's a little bit of a slow period, but the Bengals did make a recent move to improve, I guess, their roster right before the NFL draft. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about a lot of things with the draft as well. Kind of some interesting topics on the table, and I think we're gonna have some fun, some interesting segments coming forward here in the show, and we'll also try, if we have time at the end, to get to some fan questions as we try and do almost every week. So leave those in the YouTube chat. Leave those in the comment portion of Cincy Jungle. We're live there as well. Or you can get in touch with us, the obinsider@gmail.com. You can tweet at us, at Bengals OBI on Twitter, and shoot us some questions, and we'll try to get to those. Connor Howe, one of our usual co-hosts, will be joining us in just a little while, but I am joined by Scott Schulze. Scott, how are you?
Good. It's actually nice and warm in Ohio. I was able to cut grass. Baseball's playing. The Reds are in first place. And yeah, kind of speaking of baseball, that thing you mentioned about the Bengals making a trade was very interesting.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about that. You mentioned baseball. The Reds are being they look like a scrappy little group from what I've gathered. As are the boys out my way, the L.A. Angels. I almost called them the Anaheim Angels, and they're the Los Angeles Angels. So they're putting together wins and come from behind fashion, and it sounds like the Reds are kind of doing some of the same things. So hopefully those two teams, who were not very good last year, we'll be doing some good things this year. So baseball season has started, but with the onset of baseball season, it's also time for the draft and free agency and all of that in the NFL world. The Bengals are gearing up for the draft, but they made an interesting move this week, Scott, in prepping for the draft, in that they traded for Jaguars defensive end Chris Smith. He's going into his fourth season. He's kind of been a backup rotational guy with the Jaguars. Has in 3 accrued seasons has only 4.5 sacks, but he kind of brings a little bit of a different skill set to the Bengals than the guys that they have currently on the roster. Your thoughts? First of all, I mean, I don't know about you. I was pretty surprised. Not only about, I mean, I didn't know that much about the player. I knew a little bit about him, but I was a little surprised myself. Were you surprised about the move, or did you expect them to did you expect the Bengals to kind of make some sort of move, whether it was a free agency signing, a trade before the draft, so they kind of open it up a little bit more?
I think, like most people, I was surprised. It was kind of interesting. I thought it was very interesting. It was Jacksonville, because the big successful trade we had was with the Jaguars when we got Reggie Nelson from them for David Jones, who was about to be cut. Now, granted, Chris Smith isn't a former first-round pick caliber guy who is going to step in and start right away. But I think, like most fans, the first response was, who is this Chris Smith guy?
Yeah.
And second one was, after looking at it, you kind of realize, okay, they're obviously not doing another Reggie Nelson thing. They're not drafting a guy to be a starter. They're drafting a guy to be rotational depth, which I think kind of says a few things. It says, one, they obviously want a body in there because they lost Hunt. 2, it says they may not think the development, even though Will Clark had 4 sacks last year and saw his playing time go up, they may not think he's a long-term answer. And I think the third thing, especially if you figure that Chris Smith only has 1 year left in his rookie deal, it kind of seems like something of just a low investment stopgap. That, hey, we want, at least a body on the roster, so we're not forced to go with a defensive end in the first 2 rounds if they don't feel the value's there. If they feel that reaching would be, Barnett or Taco or whoever it would be, they might feel, hey, we'd rather just go for the best player. If we don't get that defensive end until the middle or late rounds, at least we have someone that we can hopefully, play well enough in camp that he makes the team and gives him some depth, that like I'd say Craig Gilberry. I know they're not exactly the same player, but similar dimensions, almost like a slower Dante Moak, which is kind of cool because it kind of shows that Now, whether they know how to use someone like that, I don't know, but it is kind of cool that they at least are broadening their horizons.
Yeah, and it sounds like obviously the 2018 conditional pick, which I guess is a 7th rounder from what I've heard from the Bengals to the Jaguars. It's a conditional pick if he makes the roster. Now, so obviously the risk reward factor is there. I like what you said about his skill set in terms of his size and measurables in comparison to Dunlap, Johnson, Will Clark, and all of that. All of those guys. He's smaller. I think he's 6'1". He's a little smaller. He's known as more of a speedy guy off the edge. And for those that have been listening to this show and reading a lot of things that I write, I've long said that the Bengals need some sort of edge player, whether it's a complementary player or a starter that it can kind of mix and match the skill sets of those guys, the Dunlaps, the Johnsons, just kind of a speedier, smaller guy to match those big behemoths on the line. Scott, there's a lot of questions with this. I think, aside from maybe a little bit of excitement, I mean, it's not a blockbuster trade by any means, but it's a position of need that the Bengals were looking at going into the draft. Perhaps this opens things up, as you mentioned, in the first couple of rounds. If they're sitting there at number 9 and all of a sudden the 3rd or 4th best pass rusher is available instead of the 1st or 2nd best pass rusher, do you think that this move maybe eases up their I don't know what you want to call it, obsession or need or whatever for an edge rusher in those first couple of rounds, even though this guy Chris Smith only has 4.5 career sacks in the NFL?
I think ultimately it probably doesn't affect the draft a whole lot, only if we consider they are a best player available team. And let's say someone like Myles Garrett falls with them at number 9. Obviously, that's kind of ridiculous. Right. But if he did, I think they would take him regardless of having traded for Chris Smith. So I think it's one of those things where I think they're still going to go after whoever they want to go after as far as best player, I think. But I think it just gives them that flexibility of knowing, hey, if worst comes to worst, the way it works out, let's say we were going to do defensive end round 2. Instead, we grab someone like Joe Mixon. Let's say they decided to use a mid-round pick, 3rd or 4th, to get that kicker because they really want a kicker, try something different this year. And so maybe it turns out, hey, we didn't get a defensive end until the 5th round. Now you don't have to go into the OTAs, into rookie minicamp thinking, oh, my goodness, like, are we really any better off, especially after you lost, and granted, you can say losing Hunt's not a big loss, but it's still a body. It's someone who knew the system, who, filled a spot. Now they have another guy kind of come in who can fill the spot. Kind of like they did with Gilberry. At least you have something. So I think how much of a need team. I don't know if it affects the draft too awful much. And I do like that it was a 7th rounder, because even if he plays, their history of 7th rounders really is, I mean, you kind of have to go back to TJ Houshmandzadeh to find a very productive 7th rounder. So I'm willing to give up, the chance for their typical 7th rounder, who is a guy that doesn't make it past cut down day. Figure you're giving up a guy this, Lavelle Westbrook's type, and what you're getting in return is a guy that, very well could possibly come in, if best case scenario, someone that could even rotate with Michael Johnson, maybe play a couple hundred snaps this year. So yeah, all in all, I think it's a good move.
Yeah, as I mentioned, low risk, high reward. I just wonder, because we all know how much the Bengals value those draft picks, and even if it's a 7th round pick, that may not be super valuable in the grand scheme of things. Obviously this team likes to use their draft picks. We talked last week about if the team should use all of their 11 draft picks that they've accrued. It sounds like they might. Now again, just to reiterate, this pick that supposedly was given up for Chris Smith is going to be next year. What do you think because of the way they value draft picks, the skill set of Smith, who, by the way, I mentioned he had 4.5 career sacks, not a big number, obviously, in 3 seasons, but when you look at the guy he's, I guess, sort of replacing in Margus Hunt had 1.5 career sacks in 4 seasons instead of 3. So, I mean, the production is at least a little better there. But that being said, what do you think the Smith signing means for the current guys on the roster? I mean, I think as of now, depending on what happens in the draft, but as of now, I think obviously Dunlap and Johnson are probably safe. Then you've got Clark, Gilberry, Ryan Brown, and Chris Smith now battling for spots. What do you think this means for the rest of that roster as it currently stands?
I think it means that at the it probably doesn't mean a whole lot, only because it's basically filling the this void. So if I were to guess, without knowing what they're going to do in draft, I would say, like you said, Dunlap and Johnson are your 2 starters. You're probably going to look at Clark and possibly Smith as your defensive ends, and then Gilberry probably plays takes that spot of that defensive end / defensive tackle. So I think if it does something, it either puts Gilberry on notice, I guess if that's the right word. I know they favor the veterans. So it's kind of interesting they traded for a veteran. Granted, he wasn't a Bengals veteran. So it kind of makes you wonder if he was someone they were looking at in the draft. Because it seems like when they trade players, Nelson, they're usually players that, at least on a low level, were rumored to have a Bengals interest. So I'm assuming even though he wasn't a Bengals veteran, he's probably a guy the Bengals were looking at, probably hoping had fallen to them and did not make it. So although they had their chance at him, and they picked Will Clark instead of him. So the interesting question that when Will Clark was drafted, he was kind of looked at as a reach, but he kind of fit that, that size and weight requirement they have, that 280, 270, you got 6'5" or whatever. And he had that. Smith didn't. You look at their production since they've been in the pros, as far as, the number of snaps, tackles per snap and number of sacks per snap and whatever. Smith has clearly outplayed him. And I think it was Gunther or the defensive line coach who made a comment recently that, we're not so much going to pigeonhole ourselves into just looking for a particular, our safety has to be this size, our defensive end has to be this size. We just want the best player. So it's kind of a sign that, hey, maybe they are going to do that. Maybe if they could get Kyle Alexander to buy into that and say, hey, I don't need a center who can actually bench press 40 times. I want a center who can block somebody. That'd be but at least it's a step in that direction.
Yeah, and some of that might be coach speak. I mean, Gunther says that, and yet, I mean, for a very long time under Marvin Lewis, this team has certain prototypes at positions that they like, regardless of some of the things they say publicly. Now, with the team giving up a pick, again, a low-round pick, and potentially they're looking at another high pick at an edge rusher. Do you see Chris Smith making this roster in 2017?
I'd say if I was making it right now, I could see if they draft someone, let's say they draft somebody, I think Gilberry, Clark, and Smith are probably 3 guys fighting for one spot, depending on what happens at defensive tackle. Because if you figure Geno Atkins is going to be a starter, I think a lot of people are high on they keep forgetting his name because he keeps getting hurt.
Billings or Hardison? Hardison.
I guess both. You figure those 2 guys are taking a spot. They usually carry 8 defensive linemen. So I think what you get down to would be a very interesting camp battle between Smith, Gilberry, and Clark, possibly for a last spot. And I think the one thing that might give Smith an edge is he's versatile. He has played more than just one position, where I think Gilberry has 2, but Gilberry is obviously an older guy, a guy who has kind of bounced around. He had a very successful first year here when he came here from Kansas City. Deep down, they probably would go with I don't know. I want to say Gilberry just because he's the veteran, and they like to go for those kind of, the guy who's the veteran who may not have the most upside. But I think Smith has a decent chance. So I'd say at the end of the day, it's probably those 2 or 3 guys battling for one spot.
Yeah, I agree. I think he probably makes the roster because even though it's a 7th round conditional pick, I just don't see this team really making this type of move unless they really had a vision for him to be on this roster. And if you remember a couple of years ago, a guy who had a similar build to Chris Smith, Chris Carter, was on the team and actually made the final roster, and then ended up getting cut, I believe, towards the end of the year, got picked up. But he was a guy that was kind of a preseason hero and ended up playing well and being on the final roster. I think he sticks on the final roster personally. It would be interesting to see, though, Scott. I'm glad you brought that up because that was kind of going to be a question. Marvin Lewis has publicly stated this year that this offseason, especially when they've lost a number of free agents over the past 2 off seasons, that this team, that's kind of the cycle, and they're kind of getting younger, maybe even faster at certain positions on this team. Hence the Kevin Minter signing, replacing Ray Maualuga. So it would be interesting if a roster battle came down to 2 very similar guys in terms of size and what they do in Wallace Gilberry and Chris Smith. If that last roster spot came at defensive end came down to those 2, I'd be very interested to see who the Bengals would choose, if they would finally go with the youth and, hey, we made a trade for this guy, we value him, or if it's Gilberry again, a guy who has had spurts of productivity, spurts of really not being productive, but is valued by this coaching staff. I'd be interested to see at least how that would play out. Would you?
Yeah, and I kind of agree with you. I think if it came down to that, I'm assuming Smith, and I think one reason is because he isn't a true rookie; he is a veteran. That going for him. And I think one other interesting thing you mentioned earlier about how they value the picks, the fact they gave away a 2018 pick makes me think in their math they must be expecting a lot of compensation picks next year.
Probably.
Yeah. An expendable pick.
Yeah, probably. I mean, with Whitworth and Pecco and they could be getting some picks there. It's also interesting that Marvin Lewis doesn't have a contract for 2018, and they sacrificed a pick in 2018. I don't know if that means anything. Maybe that means absolutely nothing, but I kind of found that to be kind of interesting. But overall, I think you and I agree that, obviously not a spectacular move, obviously a guy that isn't a superstar by any means, but could be a decent role player in this defense and boost the pass rush, which was kind of frustratingly inconsistent last year compared to years prior. They ended up picking it up at the end of the year, but this is even though they're very slow in outside free agency, even though they don't wheel and deal and do these types of things very often, this is what the Bengals like to do, at least under Marvin Lewis. They like to not go into a draft without absolutely glaring needs. And they do that by getting an outside free agent here and there, re-signing their own, and we may again, even though they're picking in the top 10 and they have 3 picks in the top 75 this year, we may again still see some of that best player available strategy come in the draft, even though, this guy's not a starter. He may just be nothing more than a rotational guy, but they now have another younger body who can get to the quarterback when given the chance. And it's going to be interesting to see how that entire roster battle plays out and how the Bengals not only view the edge rushers in this draft, but also where they may take them in this draft and if they go the best player available strategy. But I think we agree, decent move, opens things up a little bit at least in the draft, and we'll see if he can make the roster. I think he does. It's obviously very early, but I don't think they would have made this move if the plan wasn't for him to be on the roster this year at some point. So this isn't the first trade Marvin Lewis has made, especially in the renaissance that the team has experienced since 2011. You mentioned, there's Taylor Mays, cornerback Kelly Jennings was one. You go back to, I believe it was 2009. They traded for Brian Leonard. A lot of player trades, a lot of that sort of thing happening under Marvin Lewis and over the past 7, 8, 9 years. A handful of players. So Reggie Nelson, obviously, that was another one you brought up. So they even though they may frustrate some of us in outside free agency, at least they're still willing to kind of do some things and trade and make player trades to improve the roster potentially before the draft. So decent move. We'll see what happens. What are your thoughts? Obviously, there's been a lot of comments on Cincy Jungle about the trade and what it means. We'd love to hear from you, though, about the Chris Smith trade. You can get in touch with us, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, on Twitter at BengalsOBI, via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. And you can download all of our content on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube. All of our stuff is also on Cincy Jungle. So check that out. Subscribe to our channels. We appreciate the support that you have shown us during the duration of this show. We have a lot of fun doing it, and you listeners make it fun. We will be attempting to take some listener questions towards the end of the show if we have time. And so if you have those, leave those in the YouTube chat. Leave that in the Cincy Jungle comment portion, and we will try to get to those if we can. Scott, let's play a little game, and I'm interested to see. I was hoping by now that Connor Howe would be here. He should be here. What's that?
I'm assuming he was trying to fly home on United, maybe. Maybe. I hope not. For his sake, I hope not. Good Lord. He might also be selling his Padres are winning some games as well, so he may be kind of. They won earlier today, so he may be reveling in a win today and said, not Orange and Black Insider time, it's Padre time. But he should be joining us shortly, we hope. This is a segment, though. I still misunderstood you.
What's that?
You said it's Padres, right? You said Padres, like San Diego Padres? I thought you said it's Pod Racer, Star Wars.
No, but I
have no idea, Connor.
I am representing Star Wars for those of you who are live. I am representing Star Wars. And for those of you who are Star Wars fans, go rent or buy Rogue One. That just came out, so check it out. All right, we went off the rails on that one. Not pod racing, the Padres, the San Diego Padres. So let's try and get this thing back on track here for this segment, Scott, if we can. I want to call this segment Overrated, Underrated. And how we're going to do this, we're going to talk about NFL draft prospects. So I'm gonna put out a number of names that have been connected to the Bengals in one way or the other. Probably within the first 3 rounds. Now, you and I know enough about the draft and enough about prospects, just enough to be dangerous. We're not on the level of the Joe Goodberries and the Mel Kipers and all of those in the world. By the way, we'll be talking about that in just a minute as well. But I want to throw out some names, and I want you to say this player is overrated or underrated, and maybe a few sentences why. And then if Connor joins in, we can ask him some of those. I actually put in a couple of names specifically for him. But Scott, let's start with for the overrated underrated segment here. Reuben Foster, the linebacker out of Alabama. Do you believe that he is overrated, underrated, and why? Obviously, he's probably slated as being a top 15 pick in this year's draft. So do you think that that's warranted or not?
I'd say if I have to go over under and I can't go like equal rated, I think for him, and I actually just watched a lot of video on him recently, so my view has actually changed. I have become a bigger fan of his now than I was even a week ago. That being said, I'll still say he is overrated.
Really? Okay.
And several reasons for that. One, as far as I mean, there are some really nice highlights. There are some plays you watch where you're like, wow, this guy's a big hitter. I think he is very good as far as sideline to sideline. He has the speed. He can cover. I think he has enough speed to cover at the next level. He can diagnose and read a play. He can get to the running back. He does all the things you want him to do. It's a little hard to gauge because he has such a dominating group in front of him. But from what you can see, it seems like when he kind of sees a play, he gets it. The one thing I would like to see more from him is a lot of his big plays. He does the Taylor Mays thing where he tackles you with his shoulder and doesn't really wrap up. He kind of goes for, pretty much bring his limbs in, so he has like a bigger center of gravity, to kind of knock the guy over, which looks really cool. But I've seen more than several plays where guys kind of bounce. I mean, they go down, but a bigger back I think would kind of bounce off of him because he's not trying to really wrap him. Why I would say overrated isn't so much that. I mean, on the field, there's a lot to like about him, but it's the reason he was kicked out of the combine. The medical red, or the not red shirt, just the medical red flag. The issue with the shoulders, the surgery, those things, how it could be a lingering issue. So being that there is an injury risk, I think that's where the overrated comes in, because ideally you don't want to team pick on somebody who you don't have that confidence. And granted, I'm not a doctor. I've not had a chance to check it. I assume you haven't either, so it's hard to say what the teams have done. What they saw at the pro day, but just based on that uncertainty, and kind of the same thing you had last year with the Jalen Smith and the kid from UCLA, Miles Jack. I mean, with those, I think theirs were bigger medical concerns, but I'd say that's the biggest problem would just be it'd be kind of, I don't know, it'd just be kind of hard for me to pull the trigger at 9, not having that medical certainty.
Yeah, and obviously the Minter signing is something that something that makes linebacker a little bit less of a need for the team on some level, wherever the team may envision Reuben Foster playing for them. One player in, Scott, and I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say he's neither. I think that's exactly. I think he's a top 10, top 15 guy. I think he's physical. I think he is a guy that can, at some point, lead a defense. And there's really two schools of thought with the Bengals in their draft approach this year, and one of which is, which is admittedly I'm a little bit in this camp, is load up on the offense. Let's get some exciting skill guys. Let's put some more points on the board, and have some windfall in case, AJ Green gets hurt again, Tyler Eifert gets hurt again, the running backs aren't effective, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, the other school of thought is that, you look at it and you say, okay, what about having this nasty defense that is needed in the AFC North, and Foster next to Vontaze Burfict, and then you have Minter. It seems like a good idea on paper. The one aspect I worry about that makes him overrated is the fact that he played for Alabama, and we all know that Alabama's defense is absolutely stacked. There's every year they have a number of first-round, second-round talents. So is it kind of is it the parts that make the whole, or is it the whole that kind of makes the stars out of players? So that's the one thing I worry about. I want to welcome in Connor Howe, really just in time. Connor, for in case, because we didn't have a pre-production meeting, my friend. What we're doing, we're talking overrated, underrated in prospects. I'm going to give you a name, and you tell me whether they are overrated, underrated, in a couple of sentences as to why you believe that. And we started with, we just started, buddy. Your timing is impeccable. we just started with Alabama linebacker Reuben Foster. Your thoughts, overrated, underrated, and why?
I think among Bengal fans, it's really easy to say he's overrated. Unless he really is the next Luke Kuechly, I think it's hard to justify picking him in the top 10. I think that the notable stat that always gets thrown out there with him is that he had 0 forced turnovers throughout his time in Alabama, and it's really just the value of picking an inside linebacker in the top 10. I don't think that he would play next to Burfict in the nickel. I think that Vigil would do that. So it really doesn't just seem productive. It seems counterproductive to pick him. And that being said, maybe as a player, he might be, properly rated. We don't really know, but I think among Bengal fans, thinking that he's worth the number 9 pick as opposed to someone else, like I don't know. For me, in my case, it'd be a defensive end because people say, well, in the second round of these mock drafts, these defensive ends are still there, which we really don't know if that's going to be the case on draft night. Things are going to change. So for me, I think he's overrated. I think he's a good player. I think there's a chance he could, become the next, great middle linebacker. I just don't think the Bengals need that right now.
Yeah, that's you're kind of echoing a lot of Scott's sentiments, some of mine, but I think we all agree. Obviously, good player, relatively high ceiling that's ahead of him, could make for a very, very physical and mean defense for the Bengals. Lined up to other guys, but it remains to be seen whether or not he will be worth that top 10, top 15 type of selection that a lot of pundits have pegged for him. Let's move on to the offensive side of the ball. And this is a guy, and I'm going West Coast homer on this one. I like this guy. Not a lot of people on Cincy Jungle like this guy. I'm not completely sure why. I think part of it is because a lot of the nation doesn't get to watch a lot of USC games because they usually play at 7 or 7:30 Pacific. I'm talking about Juju Smith-Schuster, the wide receiver out of USC. I like this kid. I think he's got more speed and more boundary speed than people give him credit for. I've seen him in person. He is built very well. He's about 6'1", 6'2", and he's like 215, 220, and he's chiseled. I see a little bit of Anquan Bolden in him. I see a little bit of but I also see some ability to stretch the field and do things yards after the catch that Bolden can't do. That doesn't mean he will be anywhere near Bolden's career. I'm calling him underrated. I'll start with you, Connor, again. Juju Smith-Schuster, wide receiver, Southern Cal, overrated, underrated, and we're talking about probably in that second round range, whether it's early second round, mid second round, whatever. I mean, he's pretty much pegged in that area. What do you think?
I think that, and I think it's probably going to be pretty easy. I think we're all going to kind of line up on most of these, but when you look at what Bengal fans are saying with him, I think it's easy to say that he's underrated. I think you made some good points with Juju Smith. I'm not even going to try to say his name because I just can't talk today. But yeah,
it is a tongue twister, isn't it?
Yeah, I was just on the phone for like an hour, so I can't talk. But
you're good.
But I think he fits what the Bengals look for in receivers, and I think it's easy for people to say, well, the Bengals need more speed, or the Bengals need more X, Y, or Z. When that might be the case, but when you look at the Bengals as a team, they operate in a very predictable way, and one of those ways is that they take, like, people talk about the Bengals having a mold at defensive end, but at receiver it is so obvious, way more obvious than the defensive end mold. Marvin Jones, Cody Core, they both were the exact same player pretty much if you just look at them on paper with their combine numbers and their measurements and their testing. And Mohamed Sanu was pretty close to them as well. AJ Green was he was a little bit of an exception because he's that superstar and he had a little bit more of everything, but they took him instead of Julio Jones when they could have easily taken Jones, but Green kind of fit more of that mold. All the receivers they're visiting are all 6'2". They all run near a 4.4 40. And so when you look at Smith-Schuster, I said it right that time. He's 6'1", but he's pretty much the same height. He has the same kind of arm length, the jumping ability, the speed. He's not a burner, but again, I think people overrate how fast Marvin Jones really was. he had like he wasn't, this guy who instilled fear, so to speak, in the defenses. He just was a good player, and that's what the
Yeah.
team is looking for. The team isn't looking for we want speed. They're looking for okay, we want a good player, and maybe a John Ross could make sense. Maybe a Taywan Taylor. All of these small, quicker guys that fans seem to love. But when you look at like what the Bengals want to do, he seems like a guy that would fit what they like, and so. From that angle, I think it's really easy to say he's underrated because so many people just want something different, which for better or for worse isn't probably going to be what the Bengals do. They're probably going to shoot Josh Reynolds or someone along those lines.
Yeah, and like you said, it's like you didn't even miss a beat, buddy. In our first segment, we talked about the Chris Smith trade, and we talked about how the Bengals like molds, certain physical molds at positions. You're very right about that, and they also their offense.
And in their defense, every team has those types of things.
Yeah,
it's very rare that
system.
teams operate outside of what they try to do.
Yeah, it's what they like in their system, and one of the things they like is yards after the catch. And if you don't like Smith-Schuster's speed, if you watch his tape, he's very good at taking a short route a long way, whether it's by breaking tackles, outrunning guys, that sort of thing, navigating through traffic. Scott, your thoughts on Smith-Schuster, overrated or underrated?
I'm going to give a very quick answer, which is something you kind of alluded to earlier, since he is a West Coast USC guy who plays when most of us who have day jobs on the East Coast, sleep. He is the one guy on the list I've not seen, so I'm just going to take a pass on him and say that's a West Coast thing.
Okay, that's totally fair. And I'll tell you what, next week I'll ask you, and you do your homework. You have a homework assignment, young man. Okay, so what I will do then, is it going to be the same for John Ross for you, or have you watched a little more tape on him?
I'd say Ross kind of reminds me of, and this is not a perfect analogy, but a Philip Dorsett or a T.Y. Hilton, kind of a smaller guy who was a speed guy, or even like a Tyler Lockett, one of those undersized guys that had flashed a lot of speed and people got really excited about. So I don't know. He obviously does some good things. I mean, he was very productive. It's hard to say how well that plays in the NFL. I mean, we've seen guys like Tavon Austin and some Missouri folks come in and not really do anything with it. And then you see guys like, Hilton come in. Obviously, he's been very, very good. So as far as where people are taking him, I'm just going to say overrated because I don't see him at like and I'm a very big Mike Williams guy. I don't see him at the Mike Williams level. A good value at 9. So based on that, I would just say overrated.
I'm going to agree with you, and I really like John Ross. Let me just preface it with that. I really like John Ross. What I worry about is if teams will drool over that 4.2 whatever speed that he ran at the combine and broke the 40-yard dash time. Granted, his production was there. He's not like for those of us that are a bit older, if you remember Troy Williamson, a guy that the Vikings took in the first round because he ran incredibly well at the combine, but he wasn't really a receiver. He didn't have any receiver skills. He was just kind of a runner. I don't think he's that. Obviously, I think he's got much more than that, and his statistics prove that against some pretty good competition in the Pac-12. I don't know that he's top 10. I think if you're talking about, if you know that his ceiling and he will reach his ceiling is Deshaun Jackson, then yeah, I think you take him. But I think at this point he is a little bit overrated. Your thoughts, Connor?
Sorry, I couldn't find that mute button. But I think John Ross, I think you guys kind of hit it on the head. I think he's overrated, and I think he's a really good player, and people are going to love his college production. But again, it's like, do the Bengals really need a guy like John Ross? I mean, people love to say that the Bengals need a deep threat, but they just need good players. They need their draft picks to pan out. And so saying that, I just don't like the idea that John Ross would be better for the team than a different player just because he's a different type of player. And when you look at him, he's a really fun player to watch, super exciting guy. But with him, I mean, and it's a really bad comparison, but when I see him, I think of Brashad Perriman because he's a really fast receiver, with extensive injury history. And how does that play? I mean, the Bengals have just dealt with 2 season-ending injuries to rookies in back-to-back years. One of them being they already picked up Wahey after he got hurt, but then they had William Jackson get hurt and Andrew Billings got hurt just to top that off. I mean, the Bengals seem like they want to win now. They really, I mean, I think a lot of people probably would counter that, but I really think the Bengals seem like they feel like they still want to win. And I don't mean that they want to sacrifice their future to win now, but I mean that they seem like they feel that they're still a contender in the AFC. And the AFC feels weak, so that would make sense. But all that being said, it doesn't make sense to draft another guy who there's even any sort of potential that he could miss time early, especially for a first rounder in a year where, again, we've had back-to-back years where the Bengals are getting reamed for all these off-season losses they're taking. So why, again, would we take a guy who could potentially miss, even if it's like the first few games? It just doesn't feel right. And then, and again, like with Rashad Perriman was like a super fun player to watch last year when he was on the field. He had a couple of amazing catches where it was like, oh my gosh, I really hope this guy can't. I mean, as a fan, I hope this guy can't get healthy. As a person, obviously, you hope the best for everyone. But Perriman, it's like, oh gosh, he scares me. I hope like that he doesn't figure things out in Baltimore, because if things go right for him, they're going to go really, really well. And that's the same thing with Ross. If things go right with him, he seems like a guy who is like a Dree Archer on steroids, a guy who run a 4.2 40 and actually play well. Chris Johnson in his prime, but just out receiver type of thing. Like, he has a high ceiling, but there's a lot of major question marks with him, and really with all the Washington players this year, with him and Buda Baker, and with the cornerback, I don't even remember. Like, all those guys seem, yeah, not King, but the other guy. I don't even know. But all those guys they're all really good players, but it's just, and it's unfortunate for them that they have those question marks that they have to be answered. But Sidney Jones, that's who the corner is that I was thinking of. But all of those guys, again, it's just Bengal fans want to see the team make changes schematically. And I don't know how I feel either way about that, but I think people overrate him on the fact that they think that the team needs to change schematically, which is why they need to draft John Ross.
Okay. So that's overrated, underrated, John Ross, wide receiver out of Washington. Now, guys, this is when things might get a little testy, a little difference of opinion here. Solomon Thomas, a consensus top 10 selection, the defensive lineman out of Stanford. He's a defensive end. He's a big guy, fits that mold that we talked about earlier of the defensive end that the Bengals like. But you almost wonder if he's more of a 3-4 defensive end. He might be able to kick into defensive tackle on passing downs and be able to disrupt there. A lot to like. To me, there are some questions as well. Scott, your thoughts on Stanford's Solomon Thomas?
Are we saying over underrated as far as being a top 10 pick, or where exactly are we playing?
Top 10 pick, skill set, and if the Bengals take him at 9, if that's an overrated or underrated proposition.
I'd say at 9, I'd say he's underrated. So I may disagree with you on that one. And part of the reason is I know he may not be the perfect fit. He's obviously not the speed guy. He's more of the bigger Geno Atkins, I think, as far as his role. He's, like you said, kind of that 3-4 defensive end, the guy who isn't going to be your Von Miller sprint around the edge, but he's not exactly, your big 330-pound nose tackle. He's kind of but he kind of plays everything in the middle. He's very good against the run. He can stand up to a double team. He's very good at penetrating inside. He's kind of I know a lot of people comp him to Aaron Donald, who I think fell to the number 12 overall because he was undersized. Thomas is undersized. I've seen mocks with Thomas as high as 2. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I know a couple months ago when we first started mocking, mocks first started coming out, kind of on a regular basis, you saw Thomas right around the Bengals pick, and then after you had the combine, after you had the pro days, he kind of moved up and up and up. So if he were to fall to 9, I would say he is a good pick. And I think one thing, I guess for me, it's another thing too with him is that, yeah, he's not exactly what the Bengals need as far as, on the right side. I think they'd rather, the ideal person would be someone like a Mario Williams or a Julius Peppers when they first came out of college. He's not one of those guys, but it's hard to argue that the guy's obviously very productive, very good at what he does, very young, has a lot of upside. So for that, I would say if he was still there, and I also like him a lot better than some of the alternatives we're looking at that number 9 overall. So all those being said, I'd be very happy with the pick, so I'd say he's underrated.
Okay.
And now I will turn it over for you guys to shoot me down.
Underrated for Scott. And I didn't even say anything, and you're saying I'm disagreeing with you. I didn't give my opinion yet, Scott. Connor, I
just have a hunch.
Yeah, you might be right. Connor, your thoughts on Solomon Thomas?
Yeah, I really during this time of the season, I really like to read stuff where people challenge the perceptions or assumptions that people are making. And SB Nation's Stephen White, who was a retired defensive end who I think played for the Buccaneers for a while, he wrote a piece. The title, Solomon Thomas is the 2017 NFL Draft's most frustrating prospect, where basically he just looked at Solomon Thomas and criticized him. He basically said, this is what he does well, but there are a lot of questions with him. And some of that is him taking plays off. Some of it is, he gets these Aaron Donald comps, but you can't, there's a lot of lack of play, there's a lot of lack of effort plays. He can't finish very well. A lot of what people are projecting for him are really just that, is that they're projections. And he shot up the draft board, which is automatically a red flag for me. I mean, a lot of people were assuming that people had Derek Barnett above Solomon Thomas a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. And then, the combine happens, draft buzz happens, groupthink happens, and all of a sudden now everyone is mocking him to the 49ers at 2 overall. And then there's also another piece that I really liked, which I want to plug, which is on Bolts from the Blue, which is SB Nation's Chargers blog. Kyle Posey wrote something called "There are 20 players worth a first-round pick. I compared them to cities." He basically compares a bunch of players to cities. And on his description of Solomon Thomas, he compared him to San Francisco, spoiler alert, where he basically just said that, it sounds great from afar, like the city San Francisco, but Solomon Thomas, when you look, he gets wrecked inside against the run, doesn't win enough against on the edge as a pass rusher. He's a really high athlete, and he's going to be great, but you just don't know when that's going to be. And for me, everyone's loving Solomon Thomas. I love Solomon. I hope the Bengals pick Solomon Thomas, but I think people are very quick to just assume that things are going to click for him right away, whereas I think that it's going to take a little bit of time for him to really develop into the player that people are projecting him to become. And again, I would love to have Solomon Thomas, but I think we're playing overrated, underrated, and everyone loves him. So the question is, is he as good as everyone thinks he is? And I think that the answer to that is probably no.
Yeah, and I love your point about how he shot up draft boards late. When you saw, you could take mock drafts by whoever with a grain of salt, but when you saw some mock drafts coming up towards the end of the NFL regular season, when the draft order was kind of falling into place and all of that, Solomon Thomas initially was a second round. He was mocked. I saw early mocks where he was going to the Bengals in the second round, the top of the second round. And all of a sudden he had a good game in the bowl game. And all of a sudden now he's a top 10 guy. I look at it. I like the guy. I don't love him. I look at 2 years at Stanford, only 12 sacks, eight this last year. And you look at the game by game type of stuff this last year. Had 3.5 sacks in the first 3 games, and then had another good stretch of games against Washington State, Notre Dame, Colorado, Arizona. Really, the only good team in that group is Colorado. Did have 1.5 sacks in that game, but the other teams had really down years. Then you look at a stretch against Oregon State, Oregon, and Cal, who did not have good years, and he had one sack in 3 straight weeks there. I'm sorry, he had. I take that back. Against Oregon State, Oregon, California, and Rice for 4 straight weeks, he had 0 sacks in those 4 straight weeks. And those are teams that were not very good last year. That worries me a little bit. And then he had the good game against North Carolina in the bowl game. I like him. I think I just like some other players more than him in at number 9 for the Bengals, especially since I'm a little bit more on the offensive side of the ball type of that side of the fence, I guess. So I mean, again, I like him. I just wonder if he's really a true fit for the Bengals. Connor, you had an additional thought on Solomon Thomas.
Yeah, I think it's also worth checking out on SBNation.com. We just posted like it was kind of a collective group piece, but it was 6 NFL draft predictions that will surprise you early. And I think I need to bring this up because I kind of doubled down on it earlier in the draft season. I said that Taco Charlton and Solomon Thomas, one of those two guys, would be the Bengals draft pick. If it happens, I'm definitely be like, oh, I called that. But right now, it really doesn't feel like that's going to be the case. But I've kind of doubled down on the whole Solomon Thomas thing. I think I tweeted out a couple weeks ago, and I definitely still believe this. I think he's going to be last year's version of Andrew Billings, where everyone wants him on the Bengals. Every Bengals fan wants Solomon Thomas at 9. He's going to fall to them, and he's going to pass 9, and the Bengals aren't going to take him. And, maybe he becomes the Andrew Billings in that they take him later in the draft. But I think teams don't see in him what a lot of fans are projecting. And anyways, this thing I just plugged on SBNation.com, I wrote one of the top 3 edge rushers is going to fall out of the top 10, whether it's Myles Garrett, Jonathan Allen, Solomon Thomas. All of these draft nicks have, regardless of how far, and usually it's Jonathan Allen, the one that's now falling before it was Solomon Thomas. I think Myles Garrett might not. I mean, I don't know. I think there's a chance he doesn't go number 1 overall. I think one of those 3 guys is going to fall out of the top 10, and I think if that actually happened right now, if people even mocked that, people would be shocked. Like fans would freak out over Jonathan Allen falling, past the Bengals, or Solomon Thomas passing the Bengals, Myles Garrett passing the Bengals. I really think that one of those 3. I just think that you look at even like I remember the 2011 draft, and they had like. It was one of the most stacked edge rusher classes of all time. They had like Von Miller, J.J. Watt, Ryan Kerrigan, at least 5 like first round caliber, top 10 caliber edge defenders, and only I think 2 of them went in the top 10. Even though J.J. Watt went 11 overall, I'm pretty sure. And Kerrigan went like top 20, I think. Like there were just a lot of really talented edge defenders that year, and it just once the draft comes, things change. Quarterbacks go in the top 10, offensive linemen shoot up the board. Teams really value that a lot, and running backs, sneak into the top. And there's just surprises. And I think that so many people are operating under this assumption that these guys are going to go exactly where they're getting mocked to, and I think people are in for an interesting realization, which happens on a yearly basis, where so-called fan favorite player, in this case maybe Solomon Thomas, falls out of the top 10, or where falls out of the first round maybe. I mean, not Tom. I don't think Tom's going to fall in the first round, but these guys are going to drop down the draft board, and people are going to be freaking out about how the Bengals are so stupid for not taking him. And we'll see if that's the case, if that actually happens. But I think it's interesting.
It's a good point, and I mean it happens every year. Teams move up to get a quarterback. Teams move up and around to get guys, and then this year, luckily, if you view the edge rusher as a major need for the Bengals, luckily this is a very, very deep draft for guys like that. And I do agree that somebody will probably follow the top 10 that is projected to go there inexplicably. I love the Billings reference. If you remember last year, that was a guy who was mocked to the Bengals in the first round by a lot of mocks, and they got him in the 4th. So, I mean, those kinds of things inexplicably happen. Hopefully, side note, hopefully Billings ends up being a good player for the Bengals. But by the way, Connor, you might as well be wearing an SB Nation hat tonight, buddy. I mean, you are plugging the heck out of SB Nation, and rightfully so, because if you don't know, Connor not only writes for the Bengals SB Nation site, Cincy Jungle, but he also writes for SB Nation's mothership site, SBNation.com, and does stuff. So I salute you, buddy. I know you got to plug it. I know how that goes. It's good stuff. Let's move on. We've just got a couple more because for time constraints here. And again, if you're just joining us live, we're talking overrated, underrated in terms of NFL draft prospects, and we've gone through a few already. You mentioned him a second ago, Connor, but I will start with Scott here. But you mentioned him a second ago, and I know this is Connor's guy. Taco Charlton. The Michigan defensive end, pretty productive year statistically last year. Again, one of those guys that you could see going in the top 10, or you could see maybe being, a mid to late first-round pick, depending on how things play out. Scott, you as an Ohio State guy probably saw quite a bit of Taco Charlton and know quite a bit about him. Let's try and take those Ohio State shades off for a minute. And your thoughts on Taco Charlton, overrated, underrated, especially to the Bengals at number 9, which they would probably need to take him unless something crazy happens and he ends up in the second round, which I would highly doubt that happens. But your thoughts about him to the Bengals at number 9.
I'm going to try something fancy to see if I can get multimedia to work.
Don't get hurt.
And
oh my goodness!
Wow!
Oh my goodness! For those who can't,
shots fired.
Yeah, is that? First of all, is that a Etch-a-Sketch?
No, it's one of my son's things that you have like a little magnetic pen.
Okay. Well, first things first. I'm going to let you answer. That's if you're considering that multimedia, quote unquote. I don't
Just the guy who doesn't have Twitter. Now I guess he does.
I don't know. But anyway, for those of you that are just listening to the audio portion, Scott held up what I don't know what you call that, a magnet thing or a Etch-a-Sketch type of thing, saying overrated. Overrated. Why?
I think I have to say overrated, and it's not just the Ohio State thing. I mean, I think he's from Pickerington, which is a suburb of Columbus, then went to Michigan. So yeah, could maybe be a little bit, even though he never really did a whole lot in all his years there against them. But from what I've seen, I've never really come away wowed by him, and it could be I've just not watched the right games. He seems to play more like a linebacker than a defensive lineman when it comes to the run support. He seems to get eaten up too easily by offensive linemen. I think he's probably a better pass rusher than Derek Barnett, only because he does more than one thing. I do like that he has several different moves he can do, and he's not just a sprint around the outside kind of a guy. There's things I like. I would like to see a little more production. I'd like to see a little more. I guess, yeah. I'll just put it at that. I mean, I could go on forever and ever. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to say, yeah. From what I've seen, I think he's a good player. He's not a number 9 overall player. So, I'm going to have to respect what the Doodle Pro said and leave him underrated.
So you said overrated?
Sorry, over.
Yeah.
Over.
All right. Let's not flip-flop too much there, buddy. Come on now. Connor, I think I might know where you are going to go. Here's my thing. I think overrated, but slightly. And I think it's just more of a value thing at number 9. I think he might be there at 12, 15, that sort of thing. So if the Bengals like him and want to move back, they could probably still get him there just because there are a slew of good pass rushers available in this draft, as I mentioned earlier. I will say this, and I don't want to spend a ton of time because I want to hear from Connor as well, but in some of the big games, bowl game against Florida State, a sack, big game against Ohio State, 2.5 sacks. He at least is producing in the big games, which I like to see personally. And I think that's the difference between he and Solomon Thomas for me. Obviously, two completely different players, even though they're both defensive linemen. That's kind of the difference for me. I think slightly overrated, just because I wouldn't like him at 9, but maybe if the Bengals move back a little bit, I wouldn't mind that pick. So that's my take. Connor, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think I might know where you're going with this.
Yeah, you probably do. I don't know. I think it's so hard for me to not say that he's underrated. I mean, you look at Bengal fans, and they really, I don't know if it really is having to do with Michigan or if it doesn't, but every Michigan player this year, Bengal fans hate, and I don't know why. I mean, Jabril Peppers, I think, got a lot of early praise that really felt just kind of out of place. But he's still a good player. Like he's gonna be a good football player. Taco Charlton, people hate Taco Charlton, and they say, well, the Bengals should trade back and then maybe get him at 20 something because again, it's like, oh, he in these mock drafts is going 20 something overall. But I don't know. It's kind of like my whole Solomon Thomas argument that I think teams are afraid of these tweener types like Solomon Thomas. They don't want to take that risk so high. But when you have a guy like Taco Charlton, he's built well. He's tall. He's like he just fits the mold, obviously. And I know the Bengals seem like they're swaying away from that mold, but he has like prototypical size for any team, really. I mean, he could play 3-4N, he could play 4-3N, and again, like I think the biggest knocks on him to me just don't make sense. Like the number one being again like, oh well, he'll be there at 22, but we really don't know where any of these teams are going. Especially you look at the draft order, and behind Cincinnati you have Buffalo. They might not. I don't know. I could see them taking it. Taco Charlton, New Orleans, he's been mocked there a lot. Cleveland probably won't. Arizona, I could see him playing there as a 3-4 end. I mean, they just lost Calais Campbell. Taco Charlton seems kind of like a pretty good shoe in there. Philly, I probably wouldn't go there, but Indianapolis, probably. I mean, they lost a couple of edge players. Baltimore, he could go there. So it's just all of these teams behind the Bengals, I could see any of those teams really virtually taking him. And I don't like that argument against him. And then again, number two is the whole lack of production, which I think Anthony kind of hinted at. It seems just kind of like a weak argument. And I was talking about someone on Cincy Jungle was saying that he likes his prospects with at least 10 sacks or else like they, and I think he was kind of a troll. I don't think that was actually like a serious comment.
Who was that someone?
Someone was saying, "Oh, I only like my prospects who have 10 sacks in college," and I was just going kind of like, which good in the NFL don't have sacks? Among them, J.J. Watt, and I looked at J.J. Watt's production, right, and he was a transfer. I think he walked on to some school, but he had 11 sacks in 16 games at Michigan, at Wisconsin, and he did play because I see he had all these tackles for loss. And people are saying that Taco Charlton had like a lack of production. I mean, he had 15 sacks and 22 tackles for loss over the past 2 years in only 22 games. That's a tackle for loss per game. And I don't know. I don't know what more people want from him because I'm not trying to say he's a superstar and his production, jumps off the charts. But if that's a lack of production, I mean, sign me up because like you look at the numbers, it's probably pretty close to. I don't know, maybe I don't know what Carlos Dunlap had in college, but I would guess he didn't have these eye-popping numbers. And then again, it's kind of where today's NFL is going, is these big athletic defensive ends. And sure, there's a lot of things you can knock him for. He's not a perfect prospect by any means, but the two biggest knocks on him are knocks that I just hate, and I would hate with any other prospect. I don't like him with Malik McDowell. I think McDowell would be a good pick for the Bengals. I think that it's just the notion that a guy has a lack of production in college when it's not about college numbers. It's about what you do when you become a pro. And then the idea that he'll be there on the board later in the draft when we really don't know if he's going to be on the board or not later in the draft. And for that reason, just Bengal fans not liking him, that's my argument. I mean, people are going to dislike me for saying that, and that's fine or whatever, but I just think he's very underrated because people really want to just dig into him.
That's all right. I'm sure all the people that like Solomon Thomas don't like me at the moment right now, so that's fine. That's fine, and that's what this is about. Agree to disagree. So let's just do a couple more, just for for time's sake here. We've talked at length at running back, and last week we also explored running back possibilities and all of that. I think I would assume a lot of us would think maybe Leonard Fournette is overrated, so maybe we won't go there. Let's talk about a guy who is still linked to the Bengals, but has not had the same amount of I don't know what you want to call it, publicity, or same amount of the amount of links to the team that Joe Mixon or Fournette has had, and that's Dalvin Cook, who, by the way, just met with the Bengals on a visit. So I look at him, you look at 9, and some people don't like Fournette at all. Some people love Joe Mixon. A lot of people don't like him because of who he is off the field. And then you got a guy like Dalvin Cook, who also has some off-field stuff that has kind of been swept under the rug a little bit, I guess, because of Joe Mixon and what happened with him. But Cook is a guy who can catch the ball well. He runs between the tackles well, and he's a very versatile player. One of the top backs in this draft. I guess it kind of depends a little bit on your thoughts on if the Bengals need running back. But Dalvin Cook at number 9, or Dalvin Cook as a prospect, Scott, overrated or underrated?
If we're saying 9, I think I'd have to say overrated with him or Fournette or McCaffrey or anyone. If we're looking at their second-round pick, I would have to say he's underrated. And he's a guy who I've seen fall down that far, or even farther in some mocks. At least for me, the knocks on him are, yes, he does have the off-field stuff. I think it was stuff he was charged for, but might have been dropped. So I think it's a little different than Mixon, where it was a one-time thing, but it was caught on camera. And as everyone knows, once it's on camera, once it's out there, public perception is a lot different of you. If it's just stuff that maybe happened when you were a college kid and, no one really knew about it. But the thing he kind of reminds, and this is a horrible analogy, but I think if you're on the Bengals, he would kind of be Jeremy Hill, because neither one is a very good receiver, but I think he can be a 3-down back. I mean, he's very elusive. He's much more elusive than Hill. He can make people miss. He has the speed, but he's not going to do the stuff on 3rd down that Giovanni would do. So I think if he were there in the 2nd round, I'd be very tempted to take him because of all the things he can do. So I'm just going to say 1st round overrated, 2nd round underrated.
I'm going to dispute you a little bit. I will say overrated at number 9 personally, but I will dispute you a little bit on the receiving aspect. Though his first couple of years he had 22 catches, 24 catches, not really a big deal. His last year in 2016, 33 catches, 488 yards, and a touchdown with nearly a 15 yards per catch average. The guy had over 2,200 yards from scrimmage, which is pretty impressive. So I don't think he's a great receiver, but I think he's capable. So I'm going to dispute you on that a little bit, but I'm going to agree with you a little bit on him being overrated and even though I think the Bengals need some help at the skill positions, maybe running back falls down the pecking order a little bit, but I do think he's a little bit overrated, especially at number 9. Connor, your thoughts on him?
I think he's overrated. I think it's pretty easy to say. I think, like you said, his off the field stuff gets really swept under the rug. And I'm not saying people are trying to sweep it under the rug. It's just it's like people aren't even really talking about all of these. I'm trying to like pull up, what this stuff is. But he has like an extensive, like, for me, the Mixon thing, and I'm not trying to like defend anyone here. I'm not trying to like talk about the degree of like badness, but for Cook, the issue is that he has multiple things on his red flag list of incidents where that teams are going to be concerned with. And man, I really wish I had exactly what it is in front of me, but it is what it is. And it's also just, you look at the Bengals, and again, it kind of goes back to the whole mold thing. They seem to want in Jeremy Hill. I think they're personally going to wait till probably like the 4th-ish round to take a running back, maybe later. I don't think they're going to try to draft a guy to compete with Jeremy Hill, and maybe, who knows, maybe they do. But it's just also Mixon, not Mixon, Dalvin Cook. You look at the combine, and he just wasn't overly impressive. He ran a pretty similar 40 time to Leonard Fournette, who at the time was like insanely heavier. He did well at the bench and all this stuff, but I don't know. It's the arrests and the fumbles. It really has me spooked. And I guess I don't really have much else to say. I don't like the idea of a running back going super high, but I think he's overrated in the sense that fans really want the Bengals to take a second round running back, and I think that Cook just doesn't really fit exactly what the Bengals are probably looking for. So in that case, he's probably overrated to me.
Yeah, fair enough. And one of the issues that you're talking about was assault and battery issue in 2015 that was on his record among, I think, a couple of others. Good player, obviously some questions. And even though we're not going to talk about him, we still can't avoid the topic of Joe Mixon. A lot of people in the chat room, Greg L, Elbow Skeezy in the YouTube chat are talking about grab Mixon, do what you can to grab Mixon, especially in the top of the second round, as opposed to Cook and Fournette, McCaffrey, all of those guys. There's obviously credence there. We've talked about it at length on this show. We won't go into it here, but some credence there, a lot of talent, a lot of trouble. Could be the same could be said about Cook as well. I think we're all kind of in the same boat there. Let's do one more before we move on, guys. O.J. Howard, another Alabama product who, in the rare mock draft occasion, has been tabbed to the Bengals at number 9. You look at him and you say, do you say this is the next Rob Gronkowski? This is the next Tyler Eifert. This is a guy who can change an offense. And, you look at Tyler Eifert's entering the last year of his contract, his rookie deal. He can't regularly stay healthy, unfortunately. When he's healthy, he's, a red zone, master. But just can't stay healthy. So even though he might not play a ton as a rookie, he still makes a lot of sense on paper to the Bengals at number 9. Scott, is O.J. Howard worth a tight end, worth the number 9 pick, even though he's very athletic, has a good skill set? Is he worth the number 9 overall pick? And or do you believe, just as a prospect, do you think he's overrated or underrated?
I'd say the best thing about O.J. Howard is he has given me a chance to use this thing again. We'd have to say he is overrated, and I'm going to give a couple of brief reasons. Especially overrated, I know a lot of people like to put him at number 9 with the Bengals as far as like a best player kind of a pick. That being said, he is someone who I think has definitely helped himself with a very good combine. He's obviously very big, strong, fast, tall. Kind of reminds me of Vernon Davis, who kind of came out of nowhere, had a great combine, and all of a sudden people were buzzing about him as a top 10 pick. I don't think he's quite the receiver and route runner as Davis is or was when he was coming out of college a decade ago. And whenever you watch the Alabama games, I think he's a solid blocker. And he looks like a man among boys when he's playing against defensive backs. But there's this, you just don't see outside of like the championship games, you just don't see a lot from him. There's just not, you're not watching the game thinking, wow, this guy is just phenomenal, or this guy's a great tight end. You don't see the stuff you see with folks like Tyler Eifert. You don't see the great hands, the great moves, the great, the things that a tight end does to get open and dominate. I think he could be a solid NFL tight end. He definitely has the physical attributes. I just don't see him as and I know people who love the combine and all the physical measurements. I think he's a great player. When you watch the film, you see that a team that didn't really have a lot of great passing options, and with a young quarterback, tight end is the quarterback's best friend. When you have a young, inexperienced quarterback, this Alabama had, they still don't use him. So to me, it tells them and plan to use him if you think he's that good. And for whatever reason, he just did not seem to put up the production. That you don't watch him play and think, wow, this guy's great. I think he's being a little inflated because of the combine. So yeah, I'll just say overrated.
I'm going to agree with you. I like him. I think he's very athletic. Again, I just think it's the Alabama effect. And I think that a lot of people see how successful Alabama is, and it's because they have a lot of talent and a lot of talent like OJ Howard. I wonder if he's truly the game changer. Is he the guy that has a ton of clay to mold, and he could be an All-Pro and a future Hall of Fame guy that a lot of people think he could be, and I see the athleticism that points to that, but I don't see the college production, and I'm gonna point to a couple of people in the college ranks that he would probably be comparable to in terms of star tight ends and or tight ends that were picked high. And I know this one's not going to be popular, but in 3 seasons at Oklahoma, Jermaine Gresham had 26 touchdown catches. Rob Gronkowski in 2 years at Arizona had, I believe, 16 touchdowns. And OJ Howard in 4 years at Alabama had 7. So granted, Alabama has a lot of weapons. They had Amari Cooper when he was there, and get the ball to the wideouts a little bit more. But I don't see the big time production that warrants a top 10 pick. I like him. I think he's athletic. I think he could do a lot of things. I don't know what I want, I guess, out of a top 10 pick for the Bengals, especially coming off of a 6-win season. With a number 9 pick, you got to get a guy who's going to come in and play a lot right away, contribute right away. Doesn't necessarily need to start, but needs to get on the stat sheet, needs to get a significant amount of snaps. The Bengals just traditionally aren't a 2 tight end team. When they have a good tight end, whether it's Gresham and I use the term good loosely there, but whether it's Gresham or Eifert, that's kind of their focal point in terms of getting the ball to a tight end. I don't know that their offense revolves around getting 2 tight ends out there and having an option to get either of those guys the ball. I see the value in looking into the crystal ball, if you will, and say, Eifert, like I said, can't stay healthy last year of his contract. Maybe Howard's the guy who can stay healthy and develop for a year, and then he all of a sudden becomes a star. I'm just going to say he's a little bit overrated. Still like the guy a lot. Connor, your thoughts on OJ Howard?
I think this is probably the hardest one for me to decide on, but with me, I'm going to say overrated. And I hate to pull off the sweep like that, but with the Bengals, I think what people are really overlooking is CJ Uzomah and even Tyler Croft, but I think, I'm a big Andy Benoit guy, and Benoit really seemed to like Uzomah and thought he was a really good number 2 tight end. I believe that Uzomah, should Tyler Eifert get hurt like so many people are worried about, should he leave the team via free agency or whatever, that he's a guy who, he might not be this next superstar. He's not going to be Eifert, but I don't think the Bengals are dependent on having a superstar tight end. And so I think he could be a good tight end, like a Jermaine Gresham level type of tight end. And that might, rub people the wrong way. But so there's that. And then the second thing, which I really think hurts Howard, is that, this is just very vague research, but I go to Walter Football's tight end rankings, and I see 16 guys that Walter projected that had who could go as high as the 4th round. 16 tight ends that could go in the first 4th round or first 4 rounds. There are a lot of talented tight ends in this year's draft class. And they might not be the OJ Howard, and OJ Howard has a really high ceiling, whatever. But I think that it's worth mentioning this. Tight end is becoming a lot. There are a lot more tight end prospects that are coming out who, the position has changed ever since Rob Gronkowski kind of revolutionized it with the Patriots. And I think nowadays people are, starting to grow into themselves and become these athletic tight ends, and really, like, the next generation of players are looking at Rob Gronkowski and saying, I want to be the next Gronk. Because before that, people were saying, I want to be Antonio Gates, Tony Gonzalez, and those guys were great. But the position has changed even more where, Antonio or Gates and Gonzalez, I think, have the NFL tie right now for the record for the most touchdown catches for a tight end in a career, and it's 100-something, whatever. And Gronk is almost already halfway there, or maybe more than halfway there in like 5 or 6 years. 7 years. And I just think that it's a really stacked crop, and it's going to hurt Howard because I don't think that the absolute, like you were saying, Anthony, dire need is there. And then on top of that, I think that he's overrated because people are just throwing around these buzzwords. Like I've heard so many times that he's the safest pick in the draft, and I nowadays you can just say one thing about a guy and it's going to stick with him through forever. This overrated underrated game, the reason why all of us agree on everything, it feels like, is because one person will say one thing about a guy and then everyone agrees with it. Solomon Thomas has a good combine, shoots up draft boards, people love him. Myles Garrett, people have been saying he's going to go number one to the Browns forever. Is he that much better than the next defensive end behind him? I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend like I do. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But people are all just saying that OJ Howard is so safe and he has such a high ceiling and such a high floor. To me, it's just talk. It's just buzzwords. I really don't know, and maybe I should watch more film, but I just don't really. I think that it's such a trope to just say that he's so safe and that the Bengals need a tight end because Eifert's going to get hurt again. I think it's lazy, and I just think it's just, if you're talking overrated, underrated, not should they take him at 9. I think it's hard to say that he's not overrated.
Tom Brooks in the YouTube chat room made a very good point that Alabama QBs are not that great, especially at passing the ball, throwing the ball downfield. You look at Jalen Hurts last year, the guy who played 15 games for Alabama in 2016, though he wasn't necessarily the starter from day one. He came in that first game against USC to relieve the previous starter. And you look at it and had a pretty good year, 23 touchdown passes, 9 interceptions. But you also look at it, he ran the ball 191 times. And obviously that takes opportunities out of the hands of guys like Howard, who have talent. And I mentioned the lack of stats last year. So that does play into Howard's corner. Again, if we're talking about the Bengals, I think you made a number of good points there, Connor. I think we're talking I think a lot of people put the Patriots on a pedestal, rightfully so. And you look back a couple of years ago when Gronkowski and Hernandez were on the field together, and it was a great combination, especially because the Patriots don't really value, at least most of the time, don't highly value outside threats at wide receiver. We all know what happened to Hernandez, obviously, and for lack of a better words, he's a turd of a human being. But on the field, those two together, when they were on there together and playing well, it was a great combination. I think a lot of people in Bengals land want to see the same thing with like Eifert and Howard. And it makes sense if the Bengals don't invest a high pick in wide receiver this year. So, I see it. I think he's slightly overrated. I still think there is a high ceiling and a high floor, as you mentioned, Connor. I think he's a good prospect. I think he's safe. I don't know that he's the right fit for the Bengals at number 9, and I don't know that the hype is equivalent to the production and what we've seen so far from him. But good prospect nonetheless. All these guys are good prospects that we've talked about. Unfortunately, we can't get to so many others that we could just because of time constraints. Maybe we'll do this again with a couple of other guys that we didn't get to next week. I've had a lot of fun with this. This is good, and we've had some good interaction in the chat room on some of our takes on these guys. If you have a prospect you want us to talk about in terms of overrated, underrated, or what we think of them, you can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI, via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. You can also leave comments on our YouTube chat. We're live on Cincy Jungle as well. Leave those in the comments there. You can download the show on iTunes and on SoundCloud, aside from those other platforms I mentioned. Guys, overrated, underrated was a lot of fun. Appreciate it, and we'll try and get to some more next week if we have time. I said this at the beginning of the show. We sit here and, we pride ourselves on knowing a lot, quite a bit about football and a bit about the draft. But we are, and I don't want to speak for everybody here, but I kind of pride ourselves on being a jack of all trades, where we know quite a bit about a lot of things, but we're not masters at the draft. And that's why we had Joe Goodberry on a couple of weeks ago, a guy who, though he does bring a Bengals slant, is a guy who reviews a lot of college tape, studies a lot of college prospects, and that's what they do. There are a lot of people, whether it's the national platform, locally, what have you, that study a lot of film. And everybody has their preference. So I want to ask you guys what your preference, who your preference is in terms of a go-to guy to get draft information. Now, there are a lot of different, and I think it's pertinent this time of year, obviously, because we're a couple of weeks away from the draft, but there are a lot of different names that could be thrown out there. At ESPN, there's Mel Kiper Jr., and there's Todd McShay. At NFL Network, there's Daniel Jeremiah and Mike Mayock. On Roto World and NBC, there's Josh Norris. Obviously, I mentioned Joe Goodberry. There's Dane Brugler of CBS Sports. There are a lot of different names out there, and obviously, some of these guys have similar opinions. Some of these guys have varying opinions. There's Russell Baxter. There are a lot of different guys out there that have a lot of different takes, and where you can get a lot of good information on prospects that either maybe you haven't heard of, maybe you didn't watch a lot of tape on, or maybe you had some preconceived notions on a player, and these guys help clarify that. So, as a fan, as a writer for the NFL, as all of us who write for the Cincinnati Bengals, I want to ask you who your preference is. And I don't want to slight anybody, obviously, because all of these guys are paid well because they're experts. But I want to ask you guys on who your preference is when it comes to a go-to guy for draft knowledge. Scott, I'll start with you. I named a bunch of guys. I don't know if you have someone else in your back pocket there, but who's the guy that, I guess, in terms of opinion, in terms of analysis, who's the guy that you respect the most and watch closely as it comes to prospect analysis? There may be a little bit more accurate than other guys, in your opinion, in terms of their long-term analysis of a player. Who are the guys that you respect the most on this?
I'm going to give a name probably no one would consider, but the guy who I'd say I trust the most would be this guy. And not that I'm great at it, but I think it's the engineer side of me. Like, I just don't want to accept stuff on blind faith. I'm like, oh yeah, Mayock or Kiper, whoever said this or that, therefore it's true. I think we've mentioned, especially me and Anthony mentioned, we're old enough, we've seen enough drafts, we've seen all these guys make claims that turned out to be horribly wrong on players who were can't miss picks from the Reggie Bushes on down to whoever that ended up flopping, and guys who were dinged ended up having great careers. So I think I tend to take everything all those guys say with a grain of salt, but I'll usually try to reference kind of the mutual fund approach, take a handful of them and try to get a good feel for what the general consensus is. Hey, people are generally saying this or that about that guy, and then I will look myself. I like to go back and look at the game film and try to watch, as many plays as I can of these players in different situations. For example, defensive end, because we've been talking about defensive end. How are they doing? How does he do against the run? How does he do against the pass? How does he seem to do in these formations? And whatever, just kind of get a feel for what you're seeing. And then I like to go back and look at what these people said and say, yeah, I kind of see that. Or what in the hell are they talking about? I just maybe I'll go back and watch some more. And I guess there's no one I would blindly trust, although I guess I'm kind of like that with all the media in general. I'm not going to say that Kiper and them are fake news, But I will
I was
say
just going
that
to say hashtag fake news, right?
but I think I've gotten to a point where I just want to balance anything they say with something that I actually want to check out and look at myself. But if I could not do that, and obviously I'm not going, I'm not paid to do that. I'm not going to do that for 300 some prospects, and I just had to pick a guy. I'm like, oh yeah, I might go with Mike Mayock, and only because I have just kind of come to the opinion that I don't really trust a whole lot of what I see on ESPN, and he's not on ESPN. So
okay,
I'm not sure how good of an answer that is.
No, that's what we're asking. I mean, sometimes it's the guys who have the big media platform. Sometimes it's the guys that don't, but still put a ton of time into watching film, analyzing college prospects, and that's what it's about. Mike Mayock is definitely a reliable source, and a guy. I think what separates these guys for some people as opposed to others is a guy like Daniel Jeremiah has been in a front office and worked as a scout. Louis Riddick, also with ESPN, has worked in front offices around the NFL. Mike Mayock played in the game. So I think for some people that holds more credence than for some people that are kind of the armchair quarterbacks. And I get that argument, but some of these guys know what they're looking for that haven't necessarily played in the NFL level and or been in a front office and know what they're looking for. There's a couple of people in the chat room, Chris Dill and Austin Tran, kind of both say Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks, who also do a podcast. I think it's called Move the Sticks. If you subscribe to that and you do that, go ahead and subscribe to ours as well on iTunes. So you can listen to both of them. Connor, your kind of go-to source or a guy that's most reliable when it comes to prospect analysis, draft knowledge, that sort of thing.
So I already mentioned him earlier, but I really like Andy Benoit. I think that there's different people to go to for different things that you're looking for. So when I'm looking for what does a player do well, how does he, where would he fit in the NFL? I think Andy Benoit is the best out of everyone at doing that type of stuff, as kind of the whole breaking down the film to the point where, and I understand where people are coming from with Scott and those people who really like to dig into the film themselves. Me being a lazy recent college graduate who, to be honest,
Okay.
self-admittedly didn't really watch a lot of college football ever, and I'm just still really not into the college football. Like I'll be the first to admit I'm more of like in draft season, I'm more of like an opinion aggregator where I kind of just listen to what everyone says and then kind of just form my own opinions, and maybe I'll watch a guy's like highlights or a little bit of his tape, but I just don't. I'll be the first to admit that I don't know that much about football, so I have no shame in looking at what other people do. And so like I said, when it comes to learning about these players and techniques and positions, I think Andy Benoit does a really good job, and he's a really cool guy. I mean, I interned for him for a little bit, and he is just a really cool dude. He is just a really nice person, so I like getting behind him. I also, for what it's worth, I really like Daniel Jeremiah. I think that when we get really close to draft season, like when he's doing his mock draft, like 7, 8, 9, however many he does, like the last 2 or 3, I like him because he is very good at, it's not really a talent. He speaks to these teams, and he gets a very good gauge of, who they're actually interested in. So I guess it is a talent. He's really good at kind of getting people to talk to him and say, whether or not they give him the direct information, he's pretty good at getting a feel for where teams are going to go, whether it's positionally or actual players. So I like him because I like, and his podcast, I don't know, I'm not a big Bucky Brooks guy, and people can be Bucky Brooks guys, but for me, I think when you look at his work that he does in online, specifically for me, his mock drafts are fun to watch because the guys whose names consistently get mocked to certain teams, a lot of times they end up going to that team that he has, where and and he just seems like he is kind of the first one to certain things. He had Christian McCaffrey shooting up mock draft boards a while ago, and from I mean, again, I don't really have any knowledge of what's going to happen, but it seems like Christian McCaffrey is kind of becoming a more favorable prospect, and I think that Daniel Jeremiah was kind of the first guy to point that out. So I like that Daniel Jeremiah is so connected. That's what I like about him. But when it comes to, if you want to learn and if you're a football like kind of geek, so to speak, I think Andy Benoit is really fun for people who like to learn.
Good stuff. It's hard to disagree with either of you guys. I will say there's a little bit of a dark horse I didn't mention in the chat room. It was trying to see who it was in the chat room who said it, but it was Michael Myers, another YouTube chat regular. Gil Brandt, the Godfather. I like him. If you've seen the movie Moneyball, I almost think Gil Brandt is the guy. Remember the head scout in Moneyball that Brad Pitt's character had to fire because he was kind of set in his old school ways, and they were more into profiles of certain players and weird things that really didn't have to do all that much with performing in baseball. I kind of see Gil Brandt, even though I respect the heck out of him. I kind of see him on that back nine of his knowledge of NFL career. I definitely follow him. I think he's worth a follow. He actually is great if you're tracking pro days and all of that. He goes to like all that stuff. So check him out. But not my go-to guy. I like Mayock. I'm starting to warm up a lot to Daniel Jeremiah, as you guys are. Connor, he's a San Diego guy, so you got to give him some love.
Yeah, he's big team Padres guy.
Yeah,
gotta plug the Padres.
That's right.
5-4.
Yep, we were. You weren't here, but we were saying you were probably celebrating a Padres win today. So, I like those guys. I'm going to be super unpopular with this, and I know it. I know I'm going to be super unpopular with it, but I'm going to go Todd. I'm going Mel Kiper. I like Mel Kiper. Guy's been doing it since 1984. He's been on ESPN for a long time. He's missed on some prospects. He has nailed some prospects. He's calmed down quite a bit from his days of, if you remember, Scott may remember this because he's around my age, but there was an epic interview. If you go on YouTube, there's an epic interview between Mel Kiper Jr. and the then president or GM of the Indianapolis Colts when they took Jeff George, and Mel Kiper Jr. raked him through the coals, and obviously you saw who Jeff George ended up being, kind of a little bit of a stat guy, but not a franchise quarterback by any means. I don't know. I respect his opinion. He's been doing it a long time. I know he hasn't played in the NFL. I know he kind of just did it it started off as a hobby for him, but he's a guy that is a recognizable voice, seems to have a good pulse on a lot of things. And though he's not as extremely accessible as Jeremiah, Bucky Brooks, or these guys that are really in tune and social media and whatnot, I respect the guy. I really do. And that, I will say this, it's an opinion of mine that has changed over the years, because initially when I really started watching the draft and watching the coverage of the draft, he really bothered me for a variety of reasons. But I see him now, and I respect him. I get that he's a caricature, and I get that he's easy to make fun of because of how he presents himself, I guess. But I just respect him. I do, and I'm not a big ESPN guy. I know there's faults there. There's faults everywhere else as well. But that's kind of my king of them as well. But if we're talking, and this is why we had him on the program a couple of weeks ago, if we're talking especially Bengals draft needs, we're talking, a little bit more a micro perspective as opposed to a macro perspective. I will say I do look at Joe Goodberry's Twitter quite a bit. For a guy that also has another day job, freelance writes for Cincy Jungle and other different sources. He's a guy who is followed. If you look at his Twitter followers, he's followed by Josh Norris. He's followed by Dane Brugler. He's followed by the big names because they know that he is he knows what he's talking about, and he does his homework. So, if we're talking more Bengals stuff, I guess I would say Joe Goodberry. If we're talking more a macro perspective and as a whole, I still got to go Kuiper. I mean, I respect Mayock, I respect Jeremiah, but and I'm sure I'm going to get raked over the coals for it, but I still like him. I guess I'm an old school guy, a traditionalist, but that's me. Who do you like? Who do you listen to? Who do you take? Whose words do you take as scripture when it comes to the NFL draft? We'd like to hear from you. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI, via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, or you can leave comments, ratings. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel or SoundCloud channel, get us on iTunes, leave it in the comment threads on Cincy Jungle. Connor, where can they find you on Twitter?
At YB Connor with an OR at the end, not an ER.
At YB Connor. Scott, now that we have established that you have created a Twitter account, where can people find you on Twitter?
Never mind.
All right. He didn't want to talk about Twitter. He didn't want to talk about Twitter. It's fine. I will say this. For those who, we kind of had a little mini contest about how many people could follow Scott over the next couple of over the course of the last week. I would say he probably got another 25 followers.
He's at 24. His Twitter's Smackabees, and he has 24 followers.
So Scott at Smackabees, correct?
Yeah. Yep. At Smackabees.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We mentioned Twitter, man. You bailed out right when we started talking about Twitter.
I have upgraded. Eventually, I may even upgrade from our old CRT and get a flat screen one these days.
Good stuff. All right, guys. Normally we would get to fan questions. We are running way late tonight. We appreciate the live viewers who tuned in. We've got a lot of good feedback. If we didn't get to your question tonight, whether it's in the chat room or what have you, you can get in touch with us, email, Twitter, whatever, and we'll try and get to those next week and the week after that. We try and get to fan questions almost every week. Unfortunately, just because of time constraints, we just can't. But we love doing it. We love we love fielding listener questions and answering the questions that are on your mind. We're sorry we could not get to that this week. But if you have an overrated, underrated prospect, if you want us to address other certain issues, we would love to hear from you. Get in touch with us. Download the show. We love hearing from you guys. That's going to do it. Scott, any final thoughts tonight?
I guess I'll just kind of resonate what you guys said with the Padres, and I'll say go Reds. I think they're winning again tonight. So
there you go.
Put them at 6-2.
There you go. It's those small market teams, the Angels, the Padres, and the Reds. I love it. Connor, any final thoughts before we bounce out of here?
Go Pods. I mean, I don't know. Go again. Team Taco Charlton, Team Fish Smithson, Corn Elder. Everyone join the hype train. They're gonna. I mean, hopefully the Bengals take the 3 best names in the draft. That's what I'm hoping for.
One of the things I was thinking about doing is doing a mock draft of almost a food mock draft, because there's a lot of food name type of guys in this draft, and a lot of entertaining names. And you mentioned 3 of them right there. If the Bengals ended up taking all of those guys, that would be pretty funny. Anyways,
I just want to tweet out the taco emoji every time he gets a sack. That's really all I care about.
Yeah. Okay. Talent.
So what are you going to do if we end up with Jake Butt?
Ooh, a lot of butt jokes. I would be definitely on board with that.
Booty. Yeah. Okay. Oh boy, we're off the rails again. Good lord. Guys, thanks for coming on. Thanks for staying on so long. to all the live viewers, thanks for being on to this longer show. Thanks for your feedback. We'll be on again next week, and we'll probably do something. I haven't specifically planned it out, and I don't know what your guys' schedule is yet. We'll have to talk about it, but we'll probably do something kind of special for the draft, whether it's an impromptu show or what have you. After the draft, so because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest and questions about things that happened that weekend. So stay tuned. We'll let you know about that. But get in touch with us. Subscribe to our channels. Hate to keep begging, but please do it. Please, 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 please. Thanks for being on, guys. Thanks to the live viewers. Appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon. This has been the Orange and Black Insider, courtesy of SB Nation and Cincy Jungle. Hoo day.